Hello. So in this video I'm going to try and recreate the standard Blizzard buff and debuff tracker. To begin with, I'm going to bring up WeakCores and I'm going to create a new icon, and I'll call this buff icon because I want to use it to track all of the different buffs on my character. So I could start with some load conditions, but I don't really need any because tracking buffs is appropriate for every class, spec, or location. So I'm going to leave all of those off and it'll always load. Next I'm going to go to trigger, and I want to track buffs on the player, so that means I have to set my type to aura, my unit to player, and my aura type to buff. So the defaults were fine. Lastly, I want to just make this a little bit smaller. So I'll turn this down to something like 32 by 32. And mostly that's good. The last thing I have to do is make this track every buff on me. To do that, I first have to turn on this use full scan option. What that's going to do is check all of the auras on player to match these criteria, and then by default it uses just the first one. But I want to show every buff that it matches. And so that means I have to turn on this show all matches auto clone setting. It's giving me a warning that if it auto clones, they'll all be created in the same area. So you have to control their layout with a dynamic group. So I'm going to say yes to this, and it'll make the group for me. I'll call my group buffs. And I'm back ready to configure. Now, it's auto-cloning all of the buffs that match these criteria. So I could do things like stat count or whether it contains certain tooltip. But this whole window is probably worth a video of its own because you can use it to do some interesting things. I'm focusing just on this auto-clone option. Keep in mind that you don't want to use full scan unless you have a darn good reason, because it is pretty CPU intensive. And while one or two auras that have high scan or high CPU usage are probably not the end of the world, if you had a whole bunch of them, maybe 50 or 100, that could show up as a pretty big detriment to your frame rate. So use full scan with caution. The last thing I want to do is maybe control this group a little bit. I think I'm going to make this grow to the right, and I'm going to make it align to the top, and I think I'm going to align it to the screen's top left. And then I'll just offset it from the X a bit and offset it from the Y a bit. And that looks all right. That's a good spot with those. Maybe I'll increase the spacing just a little bit. And I think I want to get rid of the text. So I'm going to just put a space in the text area. The last thing I want to do is turn on these tooltips when I hover over my buffs. And I can do that by turning this tooltip on mouse over option on. So there we go. I have just one buff on me, my little ribbon there, but if I let's see, I can put on a power word shield and a palm, and maybe I can penance myself and a spirit shell. There we go, lots of auras. And there we go. So it seems to keep track of what's going on up there, and if I hover I get my tooltip. So the basic functionality is there. I also need to do my debuff tracker. So I'll bring up WeakCores, and rather than creating this whole thing again, I'm just going to export this to a string and copy it. And now I'm going to come to New and choose Import. And if I paste my string in there, I get this box. And if I click Import, then it'll recreate that whole set of auras. I'm going to hit Done, then Import. And I have these new auras here. I just have to give them some new names. I'm going to call this debuffs, and I'll call this debuff icon. And now I need to change its position so that it's not fighting for space with my buffs. So I'll come to the group, and I'll say something like grow to the left, and maybe I want to assign this to the top right corner. And I just need to adjust the X offset and move it down a little bit so it's not on my mini map. And debuffs are pretty important, so I'm going to make them a little bit bigger. I'll set the width to 48 and the height to 48. And maybe I'll make these grow down. I can do that in group. Just make them grow down. There we go. Fix the offset a little bit. There. So I have the basic setup for some debuffs. Maybe I'll also turn on the text for them. I'll make the text %p to show how long is left. And perhaps I'll put this as a very large text, but I'm going to put it outside on the left. And I think that's good enough for this demo. So if I close this, I'd actually be not done because I have to come to trigger and make it show debuffs. And then I would be done. So I have my timeless, whatever, my disgusting oozling debuff there. I can also throw up a shield and I get a debuff and I can track it. I get my mouse over thing. So that seems to work. But what if I wanted to go a little further? Maybe on my buffs, I wanted to show stat count and time remaining. That's not very easy with weak auras. It only gives you one text thing. And while you could write a custom function, your options to position it are still pretty limited. You can kind of say inside, outside, along one of these edges, and that's about it. If you use a dedicated add-on like Raven, you can say put the stacks in the bottom right corner, offset by this many pixels to the top and this many pixels to the right. Then I want to put the time remaining on the left edge, offset by this and set up by that much. And I also get my text displayed in certain ways. Recreating all of that functionality with weak auras is actually a huge pain in the butt, if it's even possible. There's also going to be cases where these things might not show the right thing. A good example is when you try to recreate unit frames in weak auras. If you jump into a vehicle, what the standard UI will do is make your nameplate into the vehicle's health, and then your character's health gets kind of a small mini window. And weak auras won't do that for you by default. You would be responsible for all of the code to detect when you're in a vehicle, to display the second aura that has your health, and to switch the main set into the vehicle, and also to switch it back when you leave or when you get maybe crowd controlled in some way and you need that to be altered. And it ends up being a lot of work. If you just want the basic functionality, like some icons that you can mouse over, and maybe some text, and maybe some minor sorting, then weak auras is perfectly acceptable. Likewise, if you just want a cast bar, that's just a bar on the screen with maybe some text to show how long is left on the cast, an icon, and the name, then it works very well. But when you start wanting more advanced things like a latency tracker, or to show ticks on bars of channeled spells, then weak auras is not such a great choice, and it makes sense to use a purpose-built add-on. You can maybe find a way to make it work in weak auras, but it's not going to be any more efficient than using a one-off add-on, because for any given sort of functionality, you're going to end up with roughly the same code. And that means you're going to use roughly the same amount of CPU, roughly the same amount of memory. And if you're using the same amount of those scarce resources, then it doesn't really matter whether you do it in one add-on or you do it in 100 add-ons. Any amount of functionality is going to require roughly the same amount of resources. Worse than that is I'm not a great programmer when it comes to Lua, and I don't have very much experience with WoW API, so I kind of hack my way through and I get the job done. Someone who's been maintaining an add-on that's been around since Classic, they've been working at that thing for more than half a decade. They know what they're doing. They're probably pretty talented. They've probably stumbled a few times and worked through their mistakes, and their code is that much better for it. It's pretty unreasonable to think that in my first crack in 15 minutes, I'm going to get something anywhere near as good as something that's been maintained for a very long time. Rather than trying to come up to their level, I'm pretty happy to just stand on their shoulders, take what they've done, and use it in my own UI. You might feel the same way for some things and not others, and that's fine. Just make sure that you don't have this awesome tool that is weak auras and say, well, I can smash down every nail with it. I can use it as like the ultimate hammer. Some of your problems might require a screwdriver or a saw, and you don't want to just whack at them with one tool. If there's something more appropriate, you should probably use that instead. Anyway, that's enough lecturing about not pushing things in the wrong direction. I'll see you in the next one.